6.3 is completing the worksheet and then finding errors on a worksheet. So we have 3 objectives. You need to be able to prepare the balance sheet and income statement columns of a worksheet. You need to be able to total and rule the worksheet, and you need to be able to apply the steps for finding errors on a worksheet. A balance sheet is a financial statement that reports the value of a business's assets, liabilities, and owner's equity on a specific date. So notice when we look at those 3 things, that should kind of turn on that light bulb for us. Assets, liabilities, owner's equity, that's our accounting equation. So our balance sheet shows our accounting equation. So we're looking at extending our balance sheet account balances on that worksheet. So here what we're doing is we're looking at our assets, our liabilities, and our owner's equity, our accounting equation. So cash through prepaid insurance are our assets. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be extending those numbers over to our balance sheet accounts. So what I always want to look at is here I'm taking this $100 in petty cash, and I'm literally going to think of it as dragging it across to my balance sheet. Okay, 300 dragging it across, 400 dragging it across. Now, when I get to my supplies, I see that my supplies start with a $620 debit, and then when I'm dragging it across, I come up with this $530 credit. So in that case, if I have a debit and a credit, I need to subtract. When I subtract now, my new balance is going to be a debit of $90. Same thing when I look at my prepaid insurance. I start with a debit of $900. As I'm dragging it across, I come across a credit, so I need to subtract $150, and then my new balance would be a $750 debit. Okay, then I'm going to drag across my credits here. Those are my liabilities. Then I have my capital account, and my last, oops, they don't show that one dragging across. My last one would be my drawing account. Okay, next we have our income statement. Our income statement is a financial statement showing the revenue and expenses for a fiscal period. So this is going to show that revenue minus expenses equal either a net income or a net loss. So here, this is what helps me. I'm going to think of my income summary as my cutoff point. Okay, now income summary right now, we do not have an account balance for, so we do not have to worry about dragging that one across. When we look at sales, sales is where our revenue starts, and sales is actually our only revenue account. So again, I'm going to look, I have a credit balance, I'm dragging across this time to my income statement columns, to my credit balance. Okay. And then I'm looking at my expenses. So advertising across to debit, debit to debit, debit to debit, debit to debit. Now when we look at this one, our insurance expense, we don't have a balance to start with. So as I'm dragging a zero balance across, I come across a debit of $150. That then just means I'm going to have a balance now of $150. Same thing with my supplies expense. I started with a zero balance. I come across this debit of $530. My new balance now is a debit of $530. Net income is the difference between total revenue and total expenses when our total revenue is greater. So revenue, remember, is money coming in. So if our money coming in is larger than our expenses, which would be money going out, then we have what we call a net income. So next thing that we're going to do is we're going to record our net income and total and rule our worksheet. So first thing we're going to do, now this part is all done. Trial balance and adjustment columns, those parts are all done. So we're going to single line rule across our income statement and balance sheet columns. That tells us we're going to add up our this time four columns. So we're going to add up all 4 of these columns. Notice we do not have equal columns. We do not have debits and credits that equal here. That's okay, they should not equal here. After we add those up, we're going to find the difference between those 2 columns. So when I look at these here, I'm going to take 5,820 minus 2,658. That gives me a $3,162 net income. If I add these two numbers together now, notice now my debit and credit equal on my income statement. I'm going to do the same thing for my balance sheet. I'm going to subtract the two numbers, 5,387 minus 2,225. If I add that difference of 3,162 to this smaller number here, I now have a debit and credit that equal on my balance sheet. Now, since my revenue is larger than my expenses, that tells me that I have a net income. There's two ways that I can look at this. When I look at this number here, this is my revenue amount. So 5,820 is my revenue. This number here is from my expenses. So I can see right now that my sales are larger than my expenses. That tells me that I have a net income. The other way that I can look at it is the visual. When I'm looking at a worksheet, if I have a number here and a number here, that tells me that is a net income. We'll look at a net loss in a little bit. Okay, again, they show that single line rule before they adding up all of these totals, now making sure that our income statement debit and credit equal and our balance sheet debit and credit equal. After we do that, then we double line rule. Okay, now the difference between total revenue and total expenses, when the expenses are greater, so our revenue is less than our expenses, that would mean that we would have a net loss. So here they're showing us, they're just not showing us all of the columns, but here they're showing us the bottom part of our worksheet. So again, we see that here are our debit and credit on our income statement and our debit and credit on our balance sheet. First, we're going to find the difference between those two. So here we're taking 2,400 minus 2,100. The difference is a $300 difference. We would then add these two together to make them equal. On this side, subtract again to find the difference. We have that $300 difference that we'd need to add to the smaller number to make them equal. When we have two numbers on the inside like this, that tells us that we have a net loss. So that's that visual side. If we had a number in the debit income statement and the credit balance sheet, that's a net income. If they're on the inside, meaning income statement credit, balance sheet debit, that is a net loss. The other way that we can look at it is when we see here, this income statement debit, these were our expenses. So here our expenses are larger than when we have for our sales, which would be our income statement credit. That also tells us that we have a net loss. So they're doing the same thing, single line ruling, putting in those totals and making sure that our income statement totals equal and our balance sheet totals equal. Next part is looking at errors, finding them and correcting them. So there's lots of different kind of errors that we can make when we're preparing a worksheet. These are the three most common mistakes that we may make. There may be errors in the actual accounting records. There may be errors in our calculations, or an amount might be entered into our wrong column. So, oops, I want to go back to that. Really what we want to do is we want to look for these things errors when we see that our things do not equal out. That's what we should be looking for. One thing here, like if we found a $300 difference here and a $250 difference here, that is not correct. These two numbers should be equal, no matter if we have a net loss or if we have a net income. Notice how this number equals this number. They should be equal. Okay. All right, now let's look at the audit your understanding. Number one, in which balance sheet column is net income recorded on the worksheet? So when we see net income, Where would we see that on our balance sheet columns? Debit or credit? That would be our credit column. Number 2, in which balance sheet column then is net loss recorded on the worksheet? We would see a net loss recorded in our balance sheet debit column. Number 3, what is the first step in checking for arithmetic errors when 2 column totals are not in balance? We want to subtract the smaller total from the larger total to find the difference. Number 4, what is one way to check for an error caused by transposed numbers? The difference between 2 column totals can be divided evenly by 9. Number 5, what term is used to describe an error that occurs when numbers are moved to the right or left in an amount column? That is called a slide. Now, before you move on, I do want you to turn to page 173 in your book. That PowerPoint really doesn't go over those errors very well. I want you on page 173, it does talk about calculation errors. And this is really important because this will save you some time when you're trying to find those errors. So I'm actually going to go back to that slide, even though it doesn't tell us much. But when we look at this one here, the errors and calculations, on page 173, it talks about different reasons that we might find our errors in calculations. Whenever we have an error in calculations, if our debits and credits don't equal, we always want to find the difference first. Once we find the difference between those numbers, first thing that we should look at is, does the difference have anything to do with 1? So they show us that on number 1 on page 173. Is it 1 cent, 10 cents, $1, $10, $100, so on? If that is the case, it says that the error will most likely be an addition error. So we should add up our columns again. Okay, next thing, if that did not work, then we're going to look at our difference and see if our difference can be evenly divided by number 2. If the amount can be divided evenly by the number 2, we want to look then for that amount on our worksheet. What happens is we might have recorded it in the wrong column. So we might have recorded it in a debit when it should have been a credit or vice versa. Okay, so look for that specific number. If that doesn't work, we're going to again look at the difference. This time we're going to divide it by 9 and see if it can be evenly divided by 9. If it can be evenly divided by 9, we're going to look to see if we have any transposed numbers. A transposed number means, like, instead of writing 54, we wrote 45. Or instead of writing 19, we wrote 91. Okay, we can also check for the slide. The slide occurs when instead of, this is really common, instead of writing like the number 12, we wrote 120. Okay? So if it can be evenly divided by 9, we look for transposed, or we look for the slide in our numbers. If that doesn't work, again, we're going to look at the difference, and this time we're going to see, did we completely forget that number? So that difference, should it be on our worksheet, and we forgot to put it on our worksheet? Okay, so those are kind of the calculation ones. Page 174, though, then goes into some other things that we can check for any errors on our worksheet. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of those. All right, that was the end of 6.3 lecture. You can now go on to the 6.3 worksheet.